1984. A secure underground facility, Moscow Oblast. The air is a constant 63 degrees Fahrenheit. It smells of stale ozone, processed ventilation, and anxiety. A low, resonant hum vibrates through the concrete floor, the sound of generators and supercomputers buried deep beneath the earth. This is the heart of the Soviet Main Intelligence Directorate, the GRU's Signals Intelligence Nexus. A young analyst, his face pale under the glow of a radarscope, adjusts his headset. His eyes are fixed not on the frantic clutter of the Afghan tactical battlefield, the buzzing Stinger threat icons, the slow-moving helicopter formations over Panjshir, but on a single, steady, haunting return. It moves with a predatory patience over the Hindu Kush, just beyond the southern border of Soviet-occupied Afghanistan. Its electronic signature is a dense, encrypted knot of UHF and VHF traffic, a constant stream flowing eastward to the Pacific Command and westward to Strategic Air Command in Omaha. He marks its track on the glass with a grease pencil, a slow, relentless oval, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It never lands. It's always there. A senior KGB liaison officer in a crisp uniform stands behind him, smoking a paparosa. He doesn't look at the screen. He stares at the analyst's tense shoulders. The Amerikansky ghosts, he mutters, the smoke curling in the phosphorescent light. What are they watching? The question hangs, unanswered, in the chilled, sterile air. For the Soviet High Command, fighting a brutal ground war, this perpetual unblinking eye in the high-altitude darkness became an obsession and wrapped in a riddle. And its ceaseless flight was a message, in a language Moscow was desperately trying to decipher. This shadow over the battlefield leads us back to the fundamental terror of the age that created it. The story of the Looking Glass does not begin in the skies over Afghanistan. It is born in the frozen logic of mutual assured destruction, MAD. By the late 50s, the nuclear doctrine was simple. If one superpower launched a first strike, the other would retain enough surviving weapons to unleash a devastating retaliation. The result would be the end of both civilizations. This was not a theory. It was the grim bedrock of global stability. But this balance of terror had a critical vulnerability: decapitation. Both the United States and the Soviet Union knew that the most tempting target in a first strike would not be cities, but the very infrastructure of command. Knock out the political leadership, the military headquarters, the communication networks, the head of the enemy, and you might paralyze its ability to order the retaliatory strike. You could win by rendering the opponent's arsenal mute. The nuclear chessboard, therefore, became a game of protecting the ability to say yes to Armageddon, long after the first missiles were in the air. The US solution was a triad of survivable command. Land-based bunkers like the famous Cheyenne Mountain Complex were hardened. Ballistic missile submarines, hidden in the ocean depths, provided a stealthy second strike force. But the third leg was the most dynamic, the airborne command post. If the ground centers were destroyed, authority would transfer to the skies, to a flying fortress that could direct the entire nuclear arsenal. The name was deliberate, evoking the mirror image command structure. For the next 29 years, at least one specially modified Boeing EC-135C would be in the air at all times, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The aircraft itself was a masterpiece of hardened technology. It was a flying war room, insulated against the electromagnetic pulse of a nuclear detonation. Inside its pressurized cabin, a general or admiral, the airborne emergency action officer, sat with a battle staff and a football of authentication codes linked via a trailing wire, very low frequency, VLF antenna to the submerged missile submarines, and via satellite and radio to silos, bombers, and the National Command Authority. It was not a weapon, but the neural center of all the weapons. Its Soviet counterpart, known as the Zveno, Link, or Sherdak, Attic system, used modified IL-76 and Tu-142 aircraft for a similar purpose. Both sides, in a macabre synchronization, had built Doomsday planes to keep Doomsday in check. This silent parallel dance of airborne command posts created a fragile equilibrium. Each side knew the other's capability. The unspoken rule was that the continuation of these flights was a signal of normalcy. It was the cessation of a Looking Glass or a Zveno mission that would trigger ultimate alarm, a sign that a ground command had been wiped out and a nuclear war had truly begun. The aircraft were the canaries in the coal mine of superpower relations, their constant engines humming a tune of grim stability. But in December 1979, the Soviet Union made a move that threatened to shatter this delicate, invisible framework. It chose to launch a massive conventional invasion across its southern border into the mountainous, politically chaotic nation of Afghanistan. In the Kremlin's view, this was a limited intervention to secure a friendly Marxist regime on its periphery. In the Situation Room of the White House, and in the airborne command posts circling over the American Midwest, it looked like something entirely different. The first domino. A sudden, violent projection of Soviet power that could not go unanswered. The local war in the Hindu Kush was about to be wired directly into the main circuitry of the Cold War, and the Looking Glass's orbit would shift to cast a long, ominous shadow directly over the battlefield. The Politburo's decision to invade Afghanistan was made with a shocking degree of geopolitical blindness. Leonid Brezhnev and his inner circle, Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, KGB Chief Yuri Andropov, and Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, viewed it through a narrow, cynical lens. The Afghan communist government was fracturing. The Sao Revolution was eating its own. The fear was not of American tanks rolling up to the Soviet border, but of ideological contagion, a failed Marxist state on the USSR's southern flank, potentially inspiring Islamic or nationalist unrest within its own Central Asian republics. The operation, codenamed Storm 33, was designed to be swift and decisive. Elite KGB Zenit and GRU Grom units would decapitate the unstable Afghan leadership in Kabul, to be replaced by the more pliable Babrak Karmel, while the 40th Army's motorized divisions would secure key cities and arteries, in, stabilize, and out. A mirror of Prague 1968, but in a far more treacherous landscape. In Washington, President Jimmy Carter and his National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski saw a darker pattern. To them, this was not mere border policing. This was the Brezhnev Doctrine in action, the claimed right to use force to preserve socialist gains anywhere, and it represented a southward thrust toward the warm waters of the Indian Ocean and the oil-rich Persian Gulf. Carter's response was immediate and multi-layered. The rhetoric was aimed at the Kremlin, but the more tangible immediate response was a dramatic and visible escalation of US strategic posture. Almost simultaneously with the first Soviet tanks crossing the Amu Darya River, the United States Strategic Air Command, SAC, moved to DEFCON 3, a heightened state of military readiness 2 steps from war. This was not a secret. It was a public and deliberately observable signal, and the most visible manifestation of this heightened alert was the Looking Glass fleet. Where before a single EC-135D might be aloft as part of the continuous rotation, now the tempo increased. Backup aircraft were readied. The orbits became more pronounced, the electronic chatter denser. The unblinking eye widened. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62, the Doomsday plane's perpetual flight was no longer just a routine drill. It was an active, glaring component of a crisis response. This shift was detected almost instantly by Soviet signals intelligence, the Radiotechnicheskaya Razvedka. Their ground stations in the Caucasus and newly established sites in Afghanistan itself, as well as their List-class intelligence ships in the Indian Ocean, began picking up the intensified, encrypted data streams from the aircraft. A new persistent track appeared on their situation maps, an American Strategic Command node, operating not just over the continental United States or the Atlantic, but now consistently probing the periphery of the Afghan theatre. The message was chilling in its clarity. We are watching, we are connected. This local war you have started is now under the umbrella of our global strategic system. A misstep here could trigger consequences there. For the Soviet commanders on the ground in Afghanistan, the war was a brutal counterinsurgency against the Mujahideen. They fought ambushes in the Panjshir Valley, secured the Salang Pass, and tried to hold cities like Jalalabad and Kandahar. Their concerns were tactical: Mi-24 helicopter gunship sorties, convoy security, the punishing terrain. But for the general staff in Moscow, the VGK and the KGB's analysts, a second shadow war was being waged in the electromagnetic spectrum. Every report of a Stinger missile strike, a weapon that would arrive years later, but whose possibility was feared from the start, was analysed not just for its local impact, but as a potential indicator of deeper American commitment. Was the CIA's Operation Cyclone, the covert aid pipeline through Pakistan's ISI being directed or monitored by that orbiting command post? Was a Mujahideen attack on a Soviet airfield a prelude to something larger? The looking glass became the ultimate symbol of this entanglement. It was a psychological weapon as much as a command platform. Its very existence forced the Soviet leadership to consider the unthinkable, that their limited contingent of forces in Afghanistan was, in the eyes of their ultimate adversary, a potential spark for the final war. This psychological and strategic bafflement, the uneasy feeling that they were fighting two wars simultaneously, one against guerrillas in the hills and another against an intangible, omnipresent spectre in the sky, would define the Soviet experience of the conflict from the highest command bunker to the forward operating bases. This deep-seated confusion, this constant looking over their shoulder at a higher-level game, forces us to examine the looking glass from multiple intersecting angles. It was not a weapon, it was a brain. The Boeing EC-135C, a modified version of the four-engine 707 airframe, was a technological citadel built for one purpose: to survive the first hour of a nuclear war and then command its continuation. Its airframe was hardened against the effects of electromagnetic pulse, EMP, the invisible continent-frying wave of energy from a high-altitude detonation that would fry unshielded electronics. Its windows were coated with a thin layer of gold to reflect thermal radiation. Inside, the environment was a world away from the chaos it was designed to manage. The cabin was a maze of communication consoles, cryptographic machines, and situation display boards. At its heart sat the Airborne Emergency Action Officer, AEAO, a one-star general or flag officer from the Joint Chiefs of Staff vested with the authority of the National Command Authority. His identity was secret, his location always moving. Beside him, a battle staff of nearly 24 officers manned stations for intelligence, communications and operations. The most critical link was the VLF, Very Low Frequency, system. A kilometres-long wire antenna would be reeled out behind the aircraft, trailing down into the denser atmosphere. VLF signals can penetrate seawater, allowing the looking glass to communicate directly with the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines lurking in the ocean depths, the most survivable leg of the nuclear triad. It could also transmit emergency action messages, EAMs, to silo fields and bomber bases via satellite and high-frequency radio. Its operational rhythm was a testament to paranoid redundancy. For 29 years, the GLASS missions flew from Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. A primary aircraft was airborne at all times, with two more on ground alert, ready to launch within minutes. The crews lived on a continuous cycle of 24-hour missions. There was no peace status. The aircraft's very presence in the sky was a declaration that the system was alive, that the retaliatory threat was credible and connected. During the Afghan war escalation, this rhythm became more urgent. Mission profiles extended. Communication drills with forward-deployed elements, including those monitoring the Afghan theatre through satellites and CIA backchannels, increased in frequency. The aircraft became a real-time fusion centre, integrating data from RC-135 reconnaissance planes, watching Soviet forces and political intelligence from Washington. It was the ultimate expression of the Cold War's central irony, a machine of apocalyptic purpose flying endlessly to ensure that purpose was never realized. Its constant detectable electronic signature was not a vulnerability but a feature, a deliberate beacon of stability that during a crisis became a glaring spotlight of warning. This technological marvel, however, was perceived through a very different lens on the other side of the Iron Curtain. In the Soviet war room, the looking glass was a cipher that generated more anxiety than understanding. Soviet military doctrine was rigid, hierarchical, and predicated on clear lines of command and definitive orders. The concept of delegating ultimate nuclear release authority to a mobile airborne general was intellectually alien and deeply unsettling. To the Soviet General Staff, VGK, it seemed recklessly flexible, even unstable. Their own Zveno system was far more constrained, designed primarily as a communications relay and mobile command post for pre-designated leadership, not as an autonomous decision-making nexus. The American system implied a trust in individual judgment at the tactical command level that contradicted Soviet political control. This bafflement manifested as a consuming paranoia. GRU and KGB analysts tasked with tracking the EC-135C fed a stream of reports to the Kremlin and the Ministry of Defense. Each shift in its orbit, each increase in its communication traffic, was subjected to intense, often grim, scrutiny. The aircraft's persistent presence on the periphery of the Afghan theatre created a constant low-grade hum of strategic anxiety. Senior Soviet commanders began to see two battlefields, the physical one of ridges and valleys, and an invisible one of perception and signalling. Every escalation in Afghanistan was now subconsciously weighed against the silent witness overhead. A decision to launch a major punitive operation, like the devastating campaigns in the Panjshir Valley, would be preceded by intelligence assessments. Had the looking-glass pattern changed? Was there a corresponding surge in US strategic forces' alertness? The psychological weight was immense. It imposed a form of unintended restraint. The fear was not that the looking-glass itself would drop bombs, but that it was the nerve centre of a system that could, and that its constant vigil meant the Americans were looking for a pretext to demonstrate their global reach. The Soviet leadership, already prone to suspicion, began to interpret the aircraft's flight as part of a broader, more menacing pattern. Was it coordinating the CIA's covert Stinger missile shipments? Was it directing real-time satellite reconnaissance for Mujahideen ambushes? The lack of definitive answers was more corrosive than any confirmed threat. The looking-glass became a Rorschach test for Soviet insecurities, reflecting back their deepest fear that their regional war was a trap designed to lure them into a global confrontation they could not win. This state of mind directly influenced command decisions in the theatre. The pervasive sense of being watched by a higher authority curtailed the Soviet appetite for extreme war-winning escalation. Proposals for deep strikes into Pakistani sanctuaries, or for the use of tactical nuclear weapons to clear mountain strongholds, were not just politically risky, they were now viewed through the prism of potentially triggering the very global response the looking-glass seemed to be monitoring for. The Doomsday plane, a symbol of American defensive caution, was successfully perceived as an instrument of offensive intimidation. It created a box around the conflict, and Soviet commanders, for all their brutal tactics within that box, became increasingly hesitant to test its walls. Yet, while the generals in Moscow grappled with this psychological spectre, the soldiers and pilots in Afghanistan faced a more immediate, tangible war. On the ground in Afghanistan, the Soviet 40th Army fought a war of dust, blood, and isolation. For a motorized rifleman huddled in an armoured personnel carrier, BTR, on the road to Gardez, or a desantnik, air assault trooper, clinging to the skid of a make helicopter descending into the green zone, the looking-glass was an abstract concept, if it was a concept at all. Their reality was the sniper's crack, the mine's blast, the relentless grinding ambush. Their technological spectres were the Mujahideen's Chinese-made rockets, and later, the searing trail of the American Stinger. Yet the influence of that high-altitude command post permeated their war in subtle, profound ways. The most direct impact was on Soviet air operations. The VVS Voyeno-Vozdushnie Sili and Army aviation faced a daunting task: establish air supremacy over a primitive country. But air supremacy did not mean freedom. From the earliest days, Soviet pilots were under strict, often frustrating rules of engagement. They were forbidden from pursuing Mujahideen across the border into Pakistan's tribal areas, even when hot on the heels of a fleeing convoy. These restrictions were political, yes, but they were enforced with acute sensitivity to the broader strategic picture. A Soviet fighter jet violating Pakistani airspace was not just a diplomatic incident. It was a potential flashpoint that could be misinterpreted by the system represented by the looking-glass. Could a rogue MiG-23 be seen as the first move in a wider attack? The constant presence of US reconnaissance, both satellite and aircraft like the RC-135, meant every Soviet flight was monitored. This scrutiny created a cage of caution. Furthermore, the Soviet High Command's paranoia about American electronic intelligence, ELN, shaped their own communication security. Tactical radio transmissions were often kept brief and cryptic, hampering coordination between ground units and their close air support. The fear was that detailed conversations could be intercepted, not just by the Mujahideen with their simple scanners, but by the sophisticated suites aboard the looking-glass and its supporting fleet, providing real-time battlefield intelligence to the CIA, and by proxy to the insurgents. This forced a return to more primitive, less efficient methods of command, slowing reaction times in a war where speed was life. The looking-glass also cast a shadow over Soviet attempts at strategic innovation. When the 40th Army began deploying advanced systems like the R-440 Covant radio-electronic warfare complex to jam Mujahideen communications, their use was measured. There was an unspoken but palpable fear. If they directed high-powered jamming towards the border regions, might they inadvertently blind or challenge the American strategic reconnaissance assets? Could an act of local electronic warfare be misconstrued as the opening of a broader conflict? The result was a hesitancy to fully employ their own technological advantages, lest they attract the unwanted, elevated attention of the system that watched from above. The Mujahideen, by contrast, operated under no such restraints. Their signals were simple, their command structure decentralized. The looking glass, a symbol of ultimate centralization, inadvertently protected the guerrillas' chaotic distributed way of war. Thus the battlefield in Afghanistan became a paradox. The Soviet Union, a military superpower, found its tactical hands partly tied by a strategic anxiety made manifest in a single, unarmed aircraft. The looking glass did not fire a shot, but it shaped the battle space. It turned the very sky into a domain of perceived threat, forcing a conventional army to fight a limited war under the unblinking gaze of what they believed was unlimited scrutiny. This tactical reality, however, was merely one piece on a much larger global board, where the looking glass played a different, yet equally critical role. Beyond the mountains of Afghanistan and the corridors of the Kremlin, the looking glass operated on the grandest stage of all, the global signalling board of Cold War brinksmanship. Its flight was not merely a functional military requirement. It was a form of high-stakes communication, a continuous, audible heartbeat of the American strategic arsenal. In the tense climate following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, every aspect of its operation was calibrated to send specific, unambiguous messages to multiple audiences. To the Soviet Union, the intensified 24/7 orbit was a signal of resolve and linkage. It communicated that the United States considered the Afghan invasion a serious enough breach of international norms to warrant a visible elevation of its global nuclear posture. The message was, your regional adventure is not isolated. We have connected it to the central balance of power. Proceed at your own peril. This was a deliberate exercise in escalation dominance, a concept championed by Cold War strategists that demonstrated capability and will to raise the stakes of a conflict to a level an opponent cannot match or is unwilling to risk. The looking glass was the ultimate symbol of that capability, a mobile piece on the chessboard that could not be captured, and whose very movement checked the opponent's ambitions. To NATO allies in Europe, nervously watching the Soviet surge southward, the looking glass provided a signal of reassurance and continuity. Its unchanging mission profile, even during crisis, demonstrated that the United States remained at its strategic post, that the umbrella of extended deterrence was still open and robust. It was a tangible proof of commitment, far more convincing than diplomatic statements. The aircraft's constant presence affirmed that the central strategic system was alert, stable, and intact, preventing European allies from potentially panicking or seeking separate accommodations with Moscow out of fear that America was distracted or decoupled. Perhaps most subtly, the looking glass sent a signal to the United States' own command structure and political leadership. Its ceaseless flight was a ritual of readiness, a physical discipline that maintained the muscle memory for nuclear command in an era of perpetual crisis. It served as a constant, sobering reminder to policymakers in Washington of the ultimate context of their decisions. When debating covert aid packages of Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen, the fact that this action was being monitored and managed under the gaze of the nation's own Doomsday command post imposed a layer of gravitas and caution. It institutionalized the connection between proxy war and strategic war, ensuring that no decision in Afghanistan was ever taken in a truly local vacuum. This global signaling function reached its zenith during periods of acute superpower tension coinciding with the Afghan war. The looking glass did not just observe these crises, it became a primary actor in them, its electronic heartbeat quickening in sync with the geopolitical pulse. The stage was now set for the moments when the theoretical purpose of this airborne command post would be most severely tested, when the bafflement in Moscow would curdle into genuine alarm, and the shadow over Afghanistan would darken into a potential prelude to global night. The simmering tension of the Afghan conflict became a rolling boil against the backdrop of a rapidly deteriorating global Cold War climate. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, with his explicit commitment to a massive military build-up and ideological crusade against the evil empire, shifted the geopolitical tectonics. In Moscow, an increasingly paranoid and geriatric leadership, now led by Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief who had helped orchestrate the Afghan invasion, saw a world closing in. They interpreted Reagan's rhetoric and policies not as posturing, but as preparation for a first strike. The Soviet war in Afghanistan was now framed within this apocalyptic suspicion. Then, in September 1983, a Soviet Su-15 interceptor shot down Korean Airlines Flight 07, killing all 269 aboard, including a US congressman. The world was horrified. Reagan condemned it as the Korean airline massacre, an act of barbarism. In the Kremlin, convinced KAL-007 was a deliberate US espionage probe, the reaction was one of siege mentality. The Looking Glass and supporting RC-135 reconnaissance flights intensified their patrols along the Soviet periphery. In Soviet command centers, the tracks of these aircraft now looked like wolves circling a wounded bear, gathering intelligence for a kill. This fever pitch reached its peak in November 1983. NATO began Exercise Able Archer 83, an annual command post drill simulating the transition from conventional to nuclear war. This year, however, the exercise incorporated new secure communication protocols and involved the highest levels of political leadership, including Reagan and Thatcher. To the hyper-vigilant Soviet intelligence apparatus, drained by the grind of Afghanistan and primed for betrayal, Able Archer looked indistinguishable from real preparation for a surprise attack. Signals intelligence reported unusual activity at US bases in Europe. The KGB residency in London flashed warnings to Moscow Centre. NATO was mobilizing. It was in this supercharged atmosphere that the Looking Glass achieved its most profound and terrifying relevance. The aircraft was no longer just a signal, it was the central nervous system of Bodybet on the very edge of fight or flight. Its communication traffic with strategic forces spiked. The drills conducted from its consoles took on a chilling realism. For the Soviet Zveno officers monitoring from their own aircraft and ground stations, the American Doomsday plane's activity pattern crossed a threshold. The fear in Moscow was that the Looking Glass was moving to assume actual command, that the Americans believed war was imminent. Simultaneously, on the Afghan battlefield, the stakes were being tangibly raised. The CIA's covert pipeline, which had once supplied only rifles and grenades, was now delivering a game-changer, the first British blowpipe, and soon the American FIM-92 Stinger anti-aircraft missile. Each successful hit on a Soviet helicopter gunship or transport aircraft was a local victory for the Mujahideen. But in Moscow it was seen as another piece of the puzzle, direct, high-tech US intervention, coordinated and perhaps even directed by the same strategic command network that flew the Looking Glass. The local and the global were fusing in the Soviet mind. The paranoid logic became a feedback loop. The US was preparing for a first strike, Able Archer. It was decapitating Soviet air power in Afghanistan and Stingers, and its ultimate command node was active and airborne, Looking Glass. The system was flashing red, and in bunkers outside Moscow, the Soviet leadership prepared to respond. The threshold of fear was about to be crossed. Yes, inside the sealed command bunkers of the Soviet Union, the world was ending on paper and screen. The intelligence streams from the KGB's Rakita line, the GRU's observations of Looking Glass activity, and the alarming reports from NATO's Able Archer exercise converged into a single terrifying assessment. The United States was in the final stages of preparing a nuclear first strike. For Yuri Andropov and the Soviet High Command, VGK, the logic was inescapable. The order was given: prepare the Soviet nuclear arsenal for possible launch on warning. Across the vast territory of the USSR, a silent, invisible machine groaned into its highest state of readiness. In the Arctic, November-class nuclear submarines readied their missiles. In Ukraine and Kazakhstan, SS-19 and SS-18 ICBMs in their silos were fueled, their targeting computers updated with final coordinates. Most critically, the Soviet counterpart to Looking Glass, the Zveno Airborne Command System, was activated. Modified Il-76 and Tu-142 aircraft took to the skies, creating a mirror image of the American posture. At forward bases in East Germany and Poland, nuclear strike aircraft, including Su-24 Fencers and Tu-22M backfires, were armed with tactical nuclear weapons and placed on system strip alert, their pilots waiting in ready rooms for the code that would send them racing westward. This was the closest the world had come to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Looking Glass, circling over the American heartland, was now no longer just a signal. It was a trigger. Its very existence, and its perceived shift to a war footing had directly provoked the Soviet Union to assume its own launch-on-warning posture. The two Doomsday systems were now locked in a reciprocal dance of dread, each confirming the other's worst fears. In Afghanistan, this global alert trickled down as a palpable tightening. Radio traffic from Soviet headquarters in Kabul to divisions in the field carried a new brittle tension. Logistics convoys were delayed as priority shifted to strategic forces. Even in the Hindu Kush, the war seemed to hold its breath, but the climax did not come. The turning point arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, dawning realization. Key figures in the Soviet intelligence apparatus, notably a senior KGB officer in London named Oleg Gordievsky, who was secretly working for MI6, began feeding London and Washington detailed reports of the Kremlin's genuine, panicked belief that NATO was about to attack. This human intelligence, combined with the West's own detection of the Soviet alert, caused a profound shock in Washington and Brussels. The Able Archer exercise was hastily, if awkwardly, concluded. A conscious, deliberate effort was made to send de-escalatory signals, and here, the Looking Glass played its final crucial role in the climax. Its mission profile did not escalate further. It maintained its vigilant orbit but did not simulate the final steps of launch procedure. This consistency, the fact that the heartbeat did not turn into a death rattle, was itself a signal. Through back channels and observed behavior, the message began to penetrate the Soviet consciousness. This was a false alarm. The Americans were not attacking. The reconnaissance, the exercises, even the stingers in Afghanistan were elements of pressure, not prelude. The moment of peak tension slowly, agonizingly began to ebb. By mid-December 1983, the Soviet nuclear forces were stood down from their hair-trigger alert. The Zveno aircraft returned to their hangars. The crisis had passed, but nothing was the same. For the Soviet leadership, the experience was a traumatic revelation. They had peered into the abyss and seen their own reflection, a reflection distorted by paranoia, but also by the very real, tangible pressure of the American strategic system, epitomized by the Looking Glass. Their Afghan quagmire was now irrevocably fused with the central nuclear nightmare. Every subsequent decision in that war would be made under the long, cold shadow of that November panic. The bafflement had turned to a chilling certainty. They were not just fighting mujahideen, they were wrestling with a hydra whose farthest head was an unblinking airborne command post that could, if provoked, summon the end of the world. The war in Afghanistan was now permanently, psychologically, a front in the larger war they knew they could not win. This seismic shift in understanding set in motion the irreversible currents that would define the endgame of the conflict, both on the ground and in the halls of global power. The trauma of the 1983 war scare left an indelible scar on the Soviet political and military psyche. The leadership that had championed the Afghan invasion was passing from the scene. Brezhnev was dead, Andropov was dead, and by 1985, Konstantin Chernenko was dead. In their place came Mikhail Gorbachev, a man acutely aware of the systemic crises consuming the USSR, economic stagnation, technological backwardness, and the debilitating drain of the Afghan war, now magnified by its perceived linkage to existential nuclear risk. The Looking Glass, and the broader American strategic posture it represented, had successfully imposed a form of strategic paralysis. Any thought of drastic escalation in Afghanistan to secure victory, such as a full-scale invasion of Pakistan or the use of tactical nuclear weapons, was now unthinkable. The price was potentially national obliteration. Thus, the Soviet military effort in Afghanistan entered a holding pattern of managed attrition. They continued to fight, and fight brutally, with scorched earth tactics, aerial bombardments, and massive use of landmines. But the objective shifted from victory to survival, to creating conditions for a dignified withdrawal. The Stinger missile, which began arriving in significant numbers in 1996, turned this managed attrition into a bleeding wound. Each downed helicopter or transport plane was not just a tactical loss. It was a symbol of American technological superiority and a reminder of the omnipresent enabling network that stood behind the Mujahideen. That network's most potent symbol, for the Soviet High Command, remained the ever-present electronic eye of the strategic command and control apparatus. The Looking Glass itself never stopped flying. Its mission continued uninterrupted through the final Soviet offensives, through the Geneva Accords of 1988, and through the last convoy of the 40th Army recrossing the Friendship Bridge at Termez in February 1989. As the final BTR rolled out of Afghanistan, the EC-135C continued its oval track over the United States. For the Soviets, this was the ultimate demonstration of American strategic permanence in their own transitory failure. They had expended tens of thousands of lives, billions of rubles, and immense political capital, all under the unflinching gaze of a system that had, without firing a shot, boxed them in and contributed to their exhaustion. The withdrawal did not end the Looking Glass's relevance to the region. As the Soviet Union retreated, the United States, in a fateful decision, also disengaged, leaving Afghanistan to a civil war. But the command and control architecture remained on alert. The aircraft monitored the chaotic aftermath, the collapse of the Najibullah regime, and the first stirrings of new threats in the region. It had been a guardian of one form of stability, the nuclear balance, even as it oversaw a theatre that descended into violent instability. The legacy of its shadow over the Afghan war was a paradox. It helped prevent a global catastrophe while contributing to the conditions for a prolonged regional one. The Soviet experience, however, was one of profound and corrosive blowback. The military's confidence was shattered. They had been outfought by guerrillas and outthought strategically by an adversary that seemed to operate on a higher, more flexible plane of warfare. The constant demoralizing awareness of American strategic surveillance and command integration, the looking glass factor, fed a deep-seated sense of technological and doctrinal inferiority within the Soviet officer corps. This institutional crisis of confidence would soon merge with economic and political collapse, but its seeds were watered in the Afghan mountains under that silent electronic sky. The full consequences of this defeat, however, would ripple far beyond the dissolution of a single empire. The final Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989 was not the end of the story. It was the catalyst for a cascading series of strategic blowbacks, many of which traced a direct line back to the psychological and military pressures epitomized by the Looking Glass. Within the Soviet Union, the Afghan war was a gaping wound. The returning soldiers, the Afghansi, were often disillusioned and alienated, a generation scarred by a conflict their government was now eager to forget. The military, the once sacred pillar of the state, was seen as bloated, incompetent, and brutalized by a war it could not explain away. The relentless sense of being observed and outmaneuvered by a superior American command technology gnawed at the legitimacy of the entire Soviet system. When the Eastern Bloc crumbled in 1989 and internal republics began agitating for independence, the will to use massive Afghan-style military force to hold the empire together had been extinguished. The Politburo had seen the global cost of such actions, the ghost of the Looking Glass, the memory of how a regional conflict triggered a global nuclear alert, now enforced a paralyzing caution. The aircraft itself evolved. In 1990, the aging EC-135C Looking Glass mission was formally concluded, but this was a transition, not a retirement. Its function was seamlessly transferred to the US Navy's E-6 Mercury, a Boeing 707-300 derivative with even greater endurance and more advanced communications, capable of commanding both the land-based and sea-based legs of the nuclear triad. The mission code name changed to Take Charge and Move Out, TACAMO, but the principle remained identical, 24/7 airborne alert. The unblinking eye had simply upgraded its lens. Its continued flight was a statement that the strategic equation born in the Cold War had survived the collapse of one of its players. For the new Russian Federation that emerged from the USSR's ashes in 1991, the legacy was a bitter one. Russian military doctrine was rewritten in the shadow of the Afghan defeat and the technological humiliation it symbolized. A deep, abiding obsession with American command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance C4ISR capabilities took root. Future Russian military development, from electronic warfare systems like the Krasuka to the development of their own modernized Zveno S airborne command posts, would be driven by a desire to blind, disrupt and defeat the kind of integrated network the Looking Glass had represented. The lessons of Afghanistan informed the brutal cyber and electronic warfare-centric tactics later seen in Chechnya, Georgia, and Ukraine. They had learned that fighting the network was as important as fighting the soldier. In Afghanistan itself, the aftermath was catastrophic. The departure of both superpowers left a vacuum filled by warlordism, then by the Taliban, and ultimately by Al-Qaeda. The very Stinger missiles whose introduction had been monitored and managed by the Strategic Command System now haunted their original suppliers, lingering in caches across the region. The Looking Glass and its successors watched this descent, their sensors collecting data on a new kind of threat, non-state networked ideological, that their original design had never anticipated. The aircraft built to manage a symmetric nuclear duel was now tracking the asymmetric seeds of a future war. Thus, the bafflement experienced by Soviet command in the 1980s resolved into a clear, harsh, historical verdict. The Looking Glass had been a pivotal, if silent, actor. It enforced boundaries, conveyed unshakable resolve, and turned a regional conflict into a strategic referendum the Soviet Union could only fail. Its constant flight was a whisper in the ears of the Kremlin, a whisper that grew into a roar of systemic collapse. You are watched. You are outmatched. You are alone. The emotional and strategic closure of this saga, however, lies not in the machinery of warning, but in the enduring human paradox it embodied. The Boeing EC-135C Looking Glass now rests in museums, a relic of a time when the end of the world had a specific airborne address. Its true legacy, however, is not found in its hardened fuselage or its dormant consoles, but in the shadow it cast across a decade and a distant mountainous war. It was never a weapon of explosive destruction, but a weapon of perception. It projected a psychological reality so potent it altered the calculus of a superpower. In the Soviet-Afghan War, we witness a profound irony of the late Cold War. The most advanced command and control system ever built, designed for global thermonuclear exchange, found one of its most impactful applications in a conflict of rifles and rocketed helicopters. It did not guide bombs onto targets in the Panjshir Valley. Instead, it guided the fears and assumptions of men in bunkers in Moscow. It turned every Soviet tactical decision into a strategic deliberation, every border skirmish into a potential tripwire. The Looking Glass created a cage of escalation the Soviet leadership dared not rattle. This is the ultimate lesson of the Doomsday plane that flew 24/7. It demonstrates that in the nuclear age, power is not merely measured in warheads or divisions, but in the credibility of command and the resilience of communication. It is about the ability to say yes at the end of the world, and the terrifying clarity required to never say it. The Soviets were not baffled by the aircraft's technology alone, but by the strategic culture it revealed. A culture that could decentralize absolute authority, maintain relentless vigilance, and integrate a regional guerrilla war into the logic of planetary deterrence without losing its nerve. The shadow over Afghanistan was therefore a shadow of restraint, a paradoxical, terrifying restraint forged in the logic of mutual annihilation. The Looking Glass ensured that a brutal, localized war of occupation remained just that, preventing it from becoming the spark for a final conflagration, even as it helped ensure the occupiers' defeat. It was a guardian of the grim peace that allowed the Cold War to end, not with a bang, but with the exhausted whimper of a retreating empire. Its ceaseless flight was a silent, eloquent testament to a single, enduring truth. In an age where everything can be seen and everything can be destroyed, the greatest power sometimes lies in making your adversary see the unthinkable, and in choosing endlessly not to do it.